Final Fantasy has featured plenty of powerhouse protagonists over the years. Some, such as Cloud Strife and Squall Leonhardt, were selected to shoulder the burden of their particular installments, leading the way in consummate fashion. But they have always been joined by an ensemble cast, and some of those cast members shone in such a way that it left players wanting more. This demand has sometimes led to Square Enix creating follow-up experiences designed to shed the spotlight on areas that they felt deserved some expansion, and perhaps the most well-known examples of this have come via the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. Dirge Cerberus, for example, was centered around Vincent Valentine. Having been an optional character in the original game who almost didn't even make it into the final product, Vincent became a fan favorite, and this notion was only amplified following his strong appearance in Advent Children. When Square Enix sought to create a third-person shooter, a few different characters were in the picture, but Vincent was ultimately chosen, and this allowed the scenario team to talk more about his relationship with Hojo and Lucrezia. Yuna and Lightning were also given more time to shine via sequels to their respective entries. But despite numerous spin-offs and sequels being created, there's always been a swell of fan demand for other characters to be given similar treatment. And it's those characters that we'll be running through today in this video, as we talk about 7 characters who deserve their own game. And we're going to kick things off with a character who was famously close to having her time in the spotlight before it was brutally ripped away. Yes, we're talking about Aranea from Final Fantasy XV. Final Fantasy XV had a notoriously troubled development cycle. However, after the game was released, the development team dedicated a lot of time towards attempting to improve the product. This saw plenty of free updates launched alongside downloadable content that focused on expanding the stories of Gladiolus, Prompto, and Ignis. But they also helped to build out other characters too, and this saw Aranea given more screen time as part of episode Prompto. During the main game, Aranea had already become something of a fan favourite due to her designation as a Dragoon, her strong boss encounters, and her ultimate defection. But it was during episode Prompto that we got to learn a bit more about Aranea and what made her tick. When Square Enix then asked fans what additional content they wanted to see, these two elements combined saw them come out in their droves in support of more content around Aranea. And when the results of the survey were revealed, those same fans were thrilled to see the announcement of Episode Aranea, which was planned to contain an entire self-contained narrative arc focused on her early development within the Niflheim Empire before explaining how and why her allegiances changed. Based on this, Episode Aranea promised to be a rather action-packed and emotional ride. But not long after the announcement of the second season pass of downloadable content, everything was cancelled following the departure of Hajime Tabata and the reallocation of resources. Episode Arden did still release, as its development was close enough to completion, but the other 3 episodes, of which Episode Aranea was included, ended up being repurposed into a novel called Dawn of the Future. This chain of events has led to continual speculation around how everything may have turned out, as even though Aranea appeared as a guest character in the main game and episode Prompto, they never got to play as the stylish Dragoon themselves, and it meant that if they ever were to create another Final Fantasy XV spin-off, Aranea stands as a strong candidate to lead the charge. Now, when we create these lists, we often restrict things to only one entry per game, but it would be difficult to imagine having a game about Balthier where he wasn't supported by Fran. This dynamic duo captured the imaginations of many people who have played through Final Fantasy XII over the years, owing to their nature as sky pirates and the tantalizing relationship that existed between the pair. After being introduced during the game's opening stages, Balthier and Fran continue to operate as dashing and daring sky pirates, with Balthier often trying to steal the limelight. After all, he was the self-declared leading man. However, as the story progressed, players learned that things weren't quite as they seemed. Balthier was trying to escape his past, and things came to a head when he was forced to square off against his father. Balthier did end up returning alongside Fran as part of Final Fantasy XII Revenant Wings, but this time they were very much part of the supporting cast, and this has led to players wanting a bit more time with their favourite on-screen personalities. What's curious about this, however, is that in the infamously cancelled Fortress, which was to be another game associated with Final Fantasy XII, instead of projecting Balthier and Fran, focus was to be placed around Basch and Ash instead. This meant that Balthier and Fran were to appear, but their role was to be more stylized. According to Ulf Andersson, who was a former studio head at Grin, the company working on Fortress, Balthier would show up towards the end to basically save everyone's ass. It was such a Han Solo move. As airship use was planned to be restricted for much of the game, this meant Balthier was to have a cameo appearance. Balthier also appeared in Final Fantasy Tactics War of the Lions in a similar capacity, but all this has just made the desire for a standalone game featuring Balthier and Fran grow even stronger. Final Fantasy VIII features another character that feels deserving of some additional screen time in Laguna Loire. As the story goes, in earlier drafts of the Final Fantasy VIII script, much more emphasis was supposed to be placed around the concept of two timelines. It was planned to see a past and present timeline playing out concurrently, with each time period having its own protagonist. This concept had been rumbling around in the mind of Yoshinori Kitase and Tetsuya Nomura since they were working together on Final Fantasy V, but it started to become more formalized when they began working on initial versions of Final Fantasy VII. Within his design documents, Kitase used movies as reference points, citing The Godfather Part 2 as a good example of what they were trying to achieve, but noting that the difference was that players had control over scenes in the past. And while the elements of the past timeline did end up having some impact on the present, Kitase insisted that nothing like Back to the Future would occur, presumably meaning that nothing could be done in the past scenario that would make the present into somewhere totally unrecognizable, or that would prevent any of the main characters in that era from being born. Ultimately, Kitase was unable to explore many of these concepts in much detail, as development of Final Fantasy VII was shelved in favour of the company putting all of its efforts into Chrono Trigger. When development resumed, the landscape had changed, and it meant that many of the ideas they wanted to implement had to wait until Final Fantasy VIII. Laguna, who was to be the protagonist of the past, was meant to have just as much screen time as Squall, the protagonist of the future. But due to various reasons, most likely a combination of time, technological and budgetary restraints, Laguna's sections and his wider role in the narrative were scaled down drastically during development, something the game's scenario writer Kazushige Nojima still laments to this day. It has led to intrigue around what Laguna's unfiltered story may have looked like, and Nojima himself has even voiced an interest in revisiting that story, ideally in a new game featuring Laguna as the protagonist. Nojima confirmed this in an interview with Famitsu. When asked what kind of story he would like to see depicted in a new Final Fantasy VIII related game, he responded, "It would focus on Laguna's life. I want to show more of his story. Maybe the segments are so popular because they're so short, but yes, this game would be about showing Laguna's bad points, and then at the very end it would show his cool side. But for it to work well, he'd really need to be depicted as a clown for most of the game." Throughout Final Fantasy IX, one of the most formidable foes faced was General Beatrix, and as an antagonist, she was known for her outward stoicism, inner vulnerability, and sheer boldness of talent. There have been characters in this mold before, such as the likes of General Leo in Final Fantasy VI, but Beatrix took things much further, with the player not even able to make her break a sweat during their numerous encounters. As the narrative progressed, Beatrix then realised the error of her ways, choosing to defect away from Queen Bran and Alexandria, and opting to fight alongside the protagonists instead. This all culminated in a tense affair on the streets of Alexandria as she fought alongside her one-time nemesis, Steiner. It was rather serendipitous, given everything that had happened, but then the joy of now playing as the all-powerful Beatrix was gone, as she retreated from the front lines to oversee the restoration of Alexandria. Ever since then, players have been pining for more Beatrix representation, and she felt tailor-made for an appearance in games such as Dissidia due to the significant amount of love there is in the community. It took some time, but that did eventually happen, as Beatrix appeared in Opera Omnia, but it always felt like, due to the nature of Beatrix as a character, there was more of her story to tell, especially during the period of time that she was honing her craft to become one of the most fearsome warriors across the entire continent. With so much looming in relation to Final Fantasy IX, there's always the potential for more, and who knows, perhaps Beatrix may be given an enhanced role in the anime series that's in production, but actually that seems to have entered into some kind of development hell now, with the last mention of it happening over a year ago. Final Fantasy X featured a similar narrative idea to Final Fantasy VIII, as even though there was significant focus placed on the adventure of Tidus and Yuna, it was underscored by a similar adventure that was undertaken by their parents many years prior. As the summoner, much of the in-lore focus and attention was placed around Braska, but it was the two guardians that stole the spotlight in terms of narrative importance. Jecht, having somehow navigated his way to Spira, found peace of mind by Braska's side, and ended up becoming his final Aeon, which subsequently saw him become the next iteration of Sin. Auron, on the other hand, who was a disgraced warrior monk, fulfilled his duty diligently, and even went so far as to further challenge the teachings of VIII when he protested against the act of the final summoning and attempted to defeat Yunalesca on his own. Auron suffered mortal wounds as a result of this decision, but he refused to be sent due to the promises that remained unfulfilled. It meant that while Braska was consigned to only appearing in historical spheres, Jecht and Auron were still very much present, albeit under different guises. And it was through this that they each gained a certain air of authority and respect for their sacrifices and accomplishments. But due to how much focus there was, players have naturally become more curious about Braska's pilgrimage. Because based on the stories recanted via the spheres, it sounds like they had a pretty awesome journey, and there has been near constant demand for Square Enix to produce what would effectively be Final Fantasy X-0, so that players could explore that journey firsthand. Moving away from the mainline entries, one character who has always received a lot of love is Cidolfus Orlandeau from Final Fantasy Tactics, and this goes beyond him just being part of the beloved shared lineage of Cids. By the time the player met Cid in the main story, he was already a seasoned warrior, and this showed, based on his prowess in battle, something which had earned him the moniker of Thunder God Cid. But this was where the intrigue lay, as much of Cid's experience was gained during the infamous 50 Years' War, which happened before the start of the game. Given the nature of Ivalice and its expansive lore, even though this rather broad skirmish took place before the main game, quite a lot was known about the conflict. And this goes beyond simple pieces of information such as why the war happened and who the victors were. Many of the characters who ended up playing a prominent part in Tactics are also remnants of this bygone era, such as Vigraf, Gafgarian, and Gareth Barrington. And it will be fascinating to see the story before the story play out from the perspective of a young and impressionable Cid, as he sought to try and bring about victory when fighting for the Order of the Southern Sky. There has, to date, never been a sniff of any kind of Tactics prequel being created. But if the rumoured Final Fantasy Tactics remaster does ever come to fruition, it could lead to a swell of intrigue and interest around the wider lore of Tactics, and this could then serve as an impetus for expansion. If that's the case, such a game focusing around the 50 Years' War would fit the bill rather nicely. That then brings us on to perhaps the most intriguing character on this list, Sephiroth from Final Fantasy VII. One of the common themes around expansion is that players often want to learn more about protagonists, and that's reflected on this list as well, with Aranea and Beatrix serving as hybrids due to their initial role as antagonists before then defecting and joining the good guys. Sephiroth, on the other hand, is very much an antagonist, and as the compilation of Final Fantasy VII was established, outside of a small stint in Crisis Core that showed him as not being that bad of a guy, the majority of his screen time has positioned Sephiroth as being super evil. When the first soldier was initially teased, there was speculation that the game was to be around Sephiroth, and when rumours were abuzz that Square Enix was also developing a Souls-like action RPG, it led to people putting two and two together. Perhaps Square Enix were working on an action RPG where they controlled Sephiroth, serving as a twist on the typical format. In the end, although there was some truth in all of this, it manifested in very different ways. Stranger of Paradise was indeed an action RPG where the roles were reversed, but it was based around the original Final Fantasy as opposed to Final Fantasy VII. And although the first soldier ended up being a battle royale game, another game trademarked at the same time, called Ever Crisis, was designed to showcase elements of Sephiroth's backstory in a way that had never been shown before. But both of these games ended up being relatively niche in the grand scheme of things. It means that should Square Enix want to continue expanding the compilation in a bold new direction, we're still open to Sephiroth starring in his own game, akin to how Vincent Valentine starred in Dirge of Cerberus. We just recommend that the quality is raised to match Sephiroth's profile within video gaming as a whole. But with that, they were 7 Final Fantasy characters who we feel deserve their own game. How many of these characters would you like to see appearing in their own expanded property? Or are there others that you feel are deserving of the spotlight even more? Be sure to let us know in the comments below. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, CloudClone28, the Livestream and Sukun TDK, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.